On the afternoon of March 25, 1911, the city of New York was preparing for a Saturday evening. People were finishing work, children were playing in the streets. The smell of food was coming from open windows across lower Manhattan. It was the kind of late winter afternoon that makes you feel like spring has finally decided to stay, cool enough for a coat, warm enough to leave it open. On the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors of the Ash Building on Washington Place, nearly 500 young women were still at their sewing machines. They were finishing the week. Some of them were thinking about what they would cook for dinner. Some were thinking about the few coins they would bring home after another 6-day week of 10-hour days. Some of the younger ones, and many of them were very young, 14, 15, 16 years old, were probably thinking about absolutely nothing except getting outside. By 4:45 in the afternoon, 146 of them would be dead. And the people who watched it happen from the street below would never recover from what they saw. The Triangle Waist Company occupied the top 3 floors of that 10-story building, and it was, by the standards of the garment industry in 1911, considered a successful operation. Isaac Harris and Max Blank, the owners, known in the trade as the Shirtwaist Kings, ran a profitable business producing the lightweight blouses that had become fashionable across America. They employed hundreds of workers, mostly young immigrant women, mostly Jewish and Italian, mostly fresh off boats from places where opportunity had run out and America had seemed like the answer to every question. These women worked in conditions that were not secret, that were not hidden, that were, in fact, completely normal for the industry at the time. They sat at long wooden tables pressed close together, rows of them, with fabric scraps piling up beneath their feet across the course of a day until the floor was covered inches deep in tissue-thin cotton and lace. They worked with open-flame gas lamps when the light was poor. They were not permitted to take breaks without permission. They were sometimes charged for the needles they used. Their bags were inspected when they left, to make sure they weren't stealing scraps of fabric. And the doors, this is the part that matters most, the part that everything else leads to. The doors were locked. Not accidentally, not occasionally. Locked deliberately, as a matter of policy, so that workers couldn't leave early and couldn't take unauthorized breaks and couldn't slip out with stolen goods. The owners had decided that controlling the exits was a reasonable way to control the workforce. This was not considered unusual. Several inspectors had noted it. Several complaints had been filed. Nothing had changed. The fire started on the 8th floor, and to this day nobody knows exactly how. The most likely explanation is a match or a cigarette. Smoking was prohibited on the floor but happened anyway, dropped into the fabric scraps that had accumulated beneath the cutting tables over the course of the day. Possibly the entire week. The scraps were so fine, so light, so dry, that what happened next was less like a fire starting and more like the room deciding, all at once, to become fire. Within seconds, the cutting tables were burning. Within a minute, the entire 8th floor was filling with smoke. There were fire pails, buckets of water placed around the floor for exactly this situation, and the men who grabbed them and threw them at the flames did the right thing, and it made absolutely no difference. The fire was already larger than buckets. The fire was already in the fabric hanging from the ceiling, already crawling across the floor, already looking for somewhere to go next. It found the stairwells. It found the elevator shafts. It found the open windows and the air that came through them, and that air fed it the way a bellows feeds a forge. On the 8th floor, some workers managed to reach the stairwell and got out. Some reached the fire escape, a single, rickety, external iron staircase that had never been designed to handle hundreds of panicking people, and started climbing down. The fire escape began to pull away from the building under the weight and the heat. People fell. The fire escape eventually collapsed entirely, taking everyone on it down to the courtyard below. The telephone operator on the 8th floor managed to call up to the 10th floor before the smoke drove her out. The owners and their staff on the 10th floor got the warning and escaped to the roof, where students from New York University Law School, their building was adjacent, helped them climb across and get to safety. The 9th floor got no warning at all. The 9th floor is where most of the dead were found. Nearly 300 workers were on that floor when the fire hit. They were the last to know. The smoke arrived before any person did. The workers who ran for the Green Street stairwell found it accessible, and many of them made it out, though the stairwell itself was burning around them as they ran. The workers who ran for the Washington Place stairwell found the door locked. They pulled at it. They screamed at it. They beat against it. The door did not open. Behind that locked door was a stairwell. On the other side of that stairwell was the street. The street was 60 feet below, and it was full of people who had looked up and seen the smoke and were already gathering, already watching, already feeling the first cold understanding that something was very wrong in that building. The fire department arrived within minutes. By the standards of the time, the response was fast. The problem was not the response time. The problem was that the ladders, the longest ladders the New York City Fire Department possessed, reached to the 6th floor. The workers were on the 9th. The firefighters extended their hoses and aimed at the windows and did everything that could be done from outside a burning building, and it was not enough. And they knew it was not enough, and they kept doing it anyway because there was nothing else to do. What the people on the street witnessed in the next several minutes is something that was recorded by dozens of eyewitnesses, reported in newspapers across the country the following morning, and described in testimony that still exists in archives today. It is not something that softens with retelling. The workers on the 9th floor, faced with a locked door on one side and a wall of fire on the other, went to the windows. Some of them hung from the ledges and dropped, hoping the distance was survivable. It was not. Some of them jumped without hanging first. Some of them were on fire when they jumped. The firefighters on the street below stretched their nets, and the bodies hit the nets so hard, falling from that height, that the nets tore, and the firefighters holding them were knocked off their feet. A man on the street, a reporter, as it happened, described watching a young man help young women onto the window ledge one by one, holding their hands, steadying them, and then watching each one fall. And then, when there was no one left beside him, he straightened his jacket, looked out over the city for a moment, and stepped off the ledge himself. Nobody who saw that forgot it. The entire event, from the first spark to the last body recovered, lasted approximately 18 minutes. In 18 minutes, 146 people died. The youngest was 14 years old. The oldest was 43. Most of them were between 16 and 23. Many of them were the primary earners for their families. Many of them had come to America within the last 5 years. Some of them had siblings working on other floors who survived. Some of them were identified only by a piece of jewelry or a distinctive shoe, because the fire had taken everything else. The city of New York went quiet in a way that cities rarely do. The funerals stretched across multiple days. One funeral procession drew 400,000 people into the streets. 400,000 in a city that was used to spectacle and had never seen anything quite like this kind of grief made public and collective. People who had no connection to the Triangle Company, who had never met any of the dead, who simply could not stay inside their homes while this was happening, came out and stood in the rain and watched the coffins go past. The two owners, Harris and Blank, were indicted on charges of manslaughter. The trial that followed became one of the most watched legal proceedings in the country. The prosecution had a clear case. The door had been locked. The fire had happened. People had died because of the locked door. The defense argued that the owners had not known the door was locked at the time of the fire, that there was reasonable doubt that the connection between the locked door and the specific deaths could not be established beyond that standard. The jury acquitted them. The city erupted. And then something happened that is, in some ways, the most important part of this entire story. The outrage didn't dissipate. It organized. Frances Perkins was a young social worker who witnessed the fire from the street. She watched the bodies fall. She watched the firefighters' nets tear. She stood there for the entire 18 minutes, and she never looked away. And she spent the rest of her life making sure that what she saw never happened again. She would eventually become Franklin Roosevelt's Secretary of Labor, the first woman ever appointed to a U.S. cabinet position, and the architect of much of the New Deal's worker protection framework. Rose Schneiderman, a labor organizer who had known many of the dead personally, gave a speech at a memorial meeting at the Metropolitan Opera House that became one of the most quoted pieces of American labor oratory ever recorded. She stood in front of an audience of wealthy reformers and told them directly that working people had tried to get help through the proper channels for years and had been met with polite sympathy and no action, and that the only thing that would change their lives was power, their own power, organized power. The International Ladies Garment Workers Union, which had actually staged a massive strike in the garment industry just 2 years earlier, a strike that had won some concessions but had not won mandatory safety standards, gained tens of thousands of new members in the months after the fire. The New York State Factory Investigating Commission was formed within weeks. Over the following 4 years, investigators fanned out across the state, entering factories, documenting conditions, interviewing workers. What they found was not surprising to anyone who worked in those conditions. What was different was that now people were paying attention, and the commission had the political backing to do something with what it found. 56 new laws covering factory safety, working hours, child labor, and fire prevention were passed in New York State in the years immediately following the Triangle Fire. Many of those laws became the model for legislation in other states, and eventually, for federal standards. The locked door, the inaccessible ladder, the absent sprinkler system, the fabric scraps on the floor. Every single one of those things was addressed in the reforms that followed. Harrison Blanc paid a civil settlement of $75 per victim. $75. They reopened their business within a few months. They were cited for locking doors in their new factory within a year. They paid a fine of $20. This is the part of the story where the anger is entirely appropriate and entirely correct, because the system that produced the Triangle Fire was not an accident, and it was not the product of one bad decision by two bad men. It was the product of a labor market that treated immigrant women as replaceable, a regulatory environment that treated safety violations as acceptable costs of doing business, and a political culture that had, for decades, looked at the conditions in those factories and decided that the discomfort of change was not worth the effort. The fire made the cost of that calculation visible. It made it visible in a way that could not be looked away from, could not be filed and forgotten, could not be met with polite concern and no action. 146 people fell from a building, or burned inside it, or were crushed in a stairwell, or were found sitting at their sewing machines. And the world watched, and the world this time actually changed. Not completely, not immediately, not without enormous ongoing struggle, but the arc bent. The laws changed. The standards shifted. The workers who came after, who sewed in factories with sprinkler systems, and unlocked doors and posted exit signs and capacity limits, enforced by inspectors with actual authority, those workers were protected by a debt they may not have known they owed. The Ash Building still stands on Washington Place in Manhattan. It is a New York City landmark now. It is called the Brown Building, and it belongs to New York University. There is a plaque on the outside. Every year on March 25th, people gather there and read the names out loud, all 146 of them. The reading takes a long time. That is the point. Each name is a person who dressed for work on a Saturday morning in the last days of winter and rode a streetcar or walked through Lower Manhattan and climbed the stairs to a room full of sewing machines and fabric and other young women who were, just like them, trying to build a life in a country that had promised them something. The promise was not kept, but the names are still read. Every year, out loud, in public, by people who were not yet born when it happened and who come anyway. Because some debts do not expire, and some lessons need to be spoken rather than simply remembered. The doors were locked. That is what this comes down to. That is the sentence that sits at the center of all of it. Not a natural disaster, not a freak event, not bad luck in any meaningful sense. A decision made by people with power over people without it. A decision made for profit, and 146 people paid for that decision with everything they had. The doors were locked. And the question that follows, the question that this story insists on asking long after the last flame went out and the last name is read on the last March afternoon, is the same question it has always been. Who holds the key, and who decided they should?